Welcome to the fifth episode of our show, The Second Sex, where we explore Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work and its lasting impact on feminist thought.
Great to be diving in.
In this episode, we turn to Chapter 3, The Point of View of Historical Materialism. It's in the Destiny section, pages 87 to 94 specifically.
That's right.
We're really going deep into the source material. You shared these excerpts from the chapter to unpack Beauvoir's take on the historical materialist view of women's situation. And, crucially, her critique of it.
Exactly. The goal today is understanding how that viewpoint explains things through economics and technology.
And then figuring out where Beauvoir thinks, hang on, this doesn't quite cover it.
Precisely. So Beauvoir kicks things off by actually acknowledging some important points from historical materialism. She agrees humanity isn't just like an animal species.
Right. We're a historical reality. Society isn't just nature, it's actively shaping the world. Praxis, they call it.
Yes, praxis, practical activity, work, transforming the environment. It's an antithesis against pure nature.
Okay, so following that logic, a woman isn't just her biological sex, her consciousness, her self-perception. It mirrors her situation, which depends on the society's economy and its technical level.
Exactly. So historical materialism looks at biological facts, say a woman's physical strength or her role in reproduction, and says these things only get their meaning or value based on how they function in action.
In a specific economic and social setup.
Right, within that concrete context.
Yeah, the source gives good examples, like early tools needed serious muscle power, so woman's generally lesser strength compared to man. That becomes a flagrant inferiority.
Yes, because the technology of that time made that physical difference really significant for productive work.
But then technology changes.
And that's the key insight. Technical progress can actually cancel out that kind of inequality. Think about modern machines. Maybe they only need a basic level of strength, something easily within a woman's ability.
Suddenly she's an equal work partner in that sense.
Potentially, yes.
Yep.
And it's not just strength. The source talks about maternal duties too.
Right, pregnancy, childcare. That burden isn't fixed. It changes massively depending on customs, societal support.
Access to childcare, how pregnancy is handled socially, all that stuff.
So this view paints a picture of women's history being tied directly to the history of technology.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Engels.
Yes, Engels' account, which is central here, he argues back in the Stone Age, tools were basic. Think simple digging sticks.
So agriculture was more like gardening, doable with female strength, and domestic stuff, pottery, weaving, that was seen as real productive work.
Correct. So you had almost two classes, men and women, but a kind of equality because both their spheres were contributing necessary production.
But then technology leaps forward. Metals arrive, bronze, iron, and the plow is...
game changers.
Yeah.
This allows for much bigger, intensive agriculture, needs more labor, leads to slavery, and the whole idea of private property takes hold. Land, tools.
And according to Engels, this is the turning point. The great historical defeat of the female sex.
Because man becomes the master of the land, master of the slaves.
And also proprietor of the woman.
The explanation given is that the division of labor got totally disrupted. Large-scale agriculture became the main source of wealth and power.
And domestic work, woman's sphere, just faded in importance next to that, economically speaking.
Exactly. So paternal right takes over from maternal right. Inheritance starts going father to son, not through the woman's clan.
Cementing the patriarchal family, built on this new foundation of private property.
And within that family structure, Engels argues, woman is oppressed, man's the boss, basically, free to have relations with slaves, courtesans.
And the source even suggests woman's main defense becomes infidelity, making adultery almost baked into the system.
Because her social oppression is seen as stemming directly from her economic oppression within that private property system.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, what's the cure according to this view?
Equality comes when the entire female sex enters public industry, gets out of the house and into the workforce.
Which only really becomes possible on a mass scale with large modern industry, right? Factories and so on, which actually need women's labor.
Precisely. And this is why historical materialism ties women's fate so closely to socialism. Bebel's famous line.
Women and the proletariat are both oppressed.
Yeah, it captures that idea. Both seen as victims of capitalism, and both will supposedly be freed by the same economic development driven by machines and industry.
So the whole complex problem of woman gets boiled down to her capacity for work.
Pretty much. She had power when tech suited her, lost it when new tools favored male strength in the dominant economic sector, and now, in the modern industrial era, the possibility of equality returns.
Hindered only by capitalist structures, in their view.
Right, and the source even mentions Soviet propaganda at the time, claiming, hey, we've already achieved this equality in the USSR.
Right, with the idea that eventually, in a global socialist world, there'd just be equal workers, no men or women in that old sense.
It's a very neat, very powerful narrative tied to economic and technological determinism.
Okay, extremely clear. But
Yeah.
here comes Beauvoir. She acknowledges Engels made progress, but ultimately calls his synthesis disappointing.
Yes, disappointing. And she says it dodges the most serious problems.
So what's so disappointing? What's it dodging?
Well, first, she points out it doesn't actually explain how societies move from communal living to private property. Engels himself basically says, we don't really know yet.
Which is a pretty big gap.
Yeah.
And does it explain if private property had to lead to women being subjugated? Was that inevitable?
That's another key question it doesn't really tackle. Was there no other path? And maybe most importantly,
Yes.
historical materialism just takes for granted that men would want private property. It says the patriarchal family arose to secure property for men, but it never asks why men had this deep-seated interest in owning things in the first place. Where does that drive come from?
Ah, right. It explains the structure that arose, but not the fundamental why behind the human desires driving it. It stays on the surface.
Exactly. So its truths seem contingent based on these unexamined assumptions. Beauvoir argues you have to go beyond historical materialism to get at these deeper questions.
Because they're not just about economics. They're about the whole man, she says. Not just this abstract economic agent, homo economicus.
Right. She's saying we need to probe something more fundamental about human existence itself.
Like what?
Well, take the very idea of owning something, saying, this is mine. Beauvoir connects this to the fundamental condition of the existent, the individual consciousness.
Okay.
She talks about this basic human tendency to assert ourselves as unique, as separate, as autonomous beings.
But just feeling separate isn't enough, right? You need ways to make that real. Tools, maybe.
Exactly. Tools are crucial. She mentions Bachelard's study of the blacksmith by physically shaping metal, imposing his will on nature through effort and skill.
Man experiences himself as a creator.
As dominant.
Yes, he asserts his singularity. He kind of forges himself while forging the tool, as she puts it. It's an act of self-creation and distinction.
Okay, that links tool use to self-awareness. But that still doesn't fully explain accumulating property, does it? No, there's another layer. Beauvoir talks about a tendency to seek ourselves by alienating oneself through the world.
Alienating oneself, how does that work?
It's a bit philosophical, but think about economic competition or the drive to acquire goods beyond immediate need. Man invests himself in his possessions. He finds his identity partly through them, paradoxically, because he sort of loses himself in the pursuit and attachment to them.
Wow. So our relationship with property isn't just practical, it's deeply tied to our sense of self, our identity project.
That's her point. Understanding this relationship between person and property needs more than just economics. It needs what she calls the whole attitude of the tool-armed man, underpinned by an ontological infrastructure.
An ontological infrastructure.
Yeah.
Like a fundamental structure of being.
Yes, something deeper than just the tool itself or the economic system. And she uses the same critical lens on Engels' explanation for women's oppression.
Right. He said her weakness relative to new tools was the key disadvantage.
But Beauvoir says, hang on, that physical limitation is only a disadvantage from a certain viewpoint.
Whose viewpoint?
Man's viewpoint, driven by his project of transcendence, his ambition, what she terms his project of enrichment and expansion. That drive to dominate, accumulate, expand, that didn't just magically appear when bronze was discovered.
It came from somewhere deeper within human consciousness.
That's the implication. And even that project, she argues, isn't enough on its own to explain oppression.
Why not?
Because the new division of labor, even with better tools, could have been organized differently. It could have been a friendly partnership.
So what tipped it into oppression, in her view?
This is core Beauvoir. She argues it stems from something even more fundamental. The imperialism of human consciousness.
Imperialism of consciousness.
Yes. It's tied to the way consciousness naturally sets up an other, defining itself by distinguishing itself from and often objectifying others. And connected to that is an original impulse towards domination over the other.
So without that inherent tendency to categorize and dominate the other, The bronze tool itself wouldn't have automatically led to women's oppression.
That's exactly her argument. The root isn't the tool. It's this dynamic within consciousness itself.
That's a fundamental disagreement with the materialist view.
Yeah,
A huge shift.
it really is. And she also slams Engels for failing to explain the specific nature of women's oppression. She says trying to reduce the sex conflict to just another class conflict is indefensible.
Why indefensible? What are the key differences?
Well, class divisions, master-slave, bourgeois proletariat, they don't have a biological basis, right? They're socially constructed economic categories.
Okay.
And importantly, oppressed classes typically revolt against their very condition. Slaves want to abolish slavery. The proletariat wants to abolish class itself.
But women's situation is different. Beauvoir points to the deep, intimate community of life and interests shared with men. And she uses the word complicity, implying it's not just simple opposition.
Exactly. Women generally don't seek a revolution to eliminate being female. The demand is usually to abolish certain consequences of sexual difference. The oppressive social structures built upon it, not the difference itself.
That leads to another huge point she makes, doesn't it? That historical materialism focuses almost solely on production.
Yes, it treats women primarily as a worker, or potential worker. Beauvoir insists you cannot ignore her reproductive function. It's profoundly important, both socially for the species and personally for the woman herself.
And sometimes, historically, having children was arguably more vital to the group than farm labor.
Absolutely. But Engels kind of sidesteps this complexity by just proposing the abstract solution,
Yeah.
abolish the family.
Which Beauvoir finds way too simplistic.
Right. The source notes how even the socialist USSR had to backtrack and adjust its family policies based on real-world needs for labor and population growth. It showed the family and reproduction aren't just easily dissolved abstract concepts.
And she points out that just getting rid of a particular family structure doesn't automatically mean liberation anyway. Cites places like Sparta or Nazi Germany as counterexamples.
True, a genuinely socialist ethic that wants justice and liberty runs into real challenges with women's condition, particularly reproduction.
How so?
Well, pregnancy and childbirth, that's not just another job. It's a profound, life-altering experience for the woman. It creates a deeper sort of break in her life than, say, military service.
And you can't just mandate sex or pregnancy. As the source says, no state tries compulsory coitus.
Right, because the sexual act, maternity, these involve deep, essential values, personal experiences that resist purely rational or economic management.
Materialism tries to ignore that powerful aspect of sexuality.
Exactly. But Beauvoir says it's futile. Eroticism, the sexual instinct. She describes it almost poetically as a revolt of the instant against time, of the individual against the universal. You can't just channel it like water or compel it like you might compel labor.
So states can't force it directly, but they can control the circumstances.
That's the mechanism. They enclose women in situations through laws about marriage, divorce, bans on contraception or abortion where motherhood becomes the path of least resistance or the only socially sanctioned path.
And the source highlights the irony that the USSR, while claiming equality, actually brought back many patriarchal constraints, even encouraging women to be erotic objects again.
Yes, emphasizing makeup, clothes, flirtation, partly to support the family structure and birth rates. It shows the limits of a purely economic view.
Yeah, that really underscores her point that woman isn't just a productive unit. For man, she's also fundamentally a sexual partner, a means of reproduction, an erotic object.
She is an other through whom man often seeks to understand or define himself. Eroticism itself highlights how individual subjective experience pushes back against purely general economic categories.
So even if you imagine a classless, democratic, socialist society, Beauvoir says individual destiny, sexual difference, these things still matter profoundly.
The unique relationship with a sexual partner, the irreplaceable bond with the child, these are irreducible aspects of human life. Woman wasn't just made by the bronze tool, and the modern machine isn't enough to unmake her unique situation either.
So demanding rights doesn't mean ignoring her specific reality.
Exactly. Which leads to her overall conclusion. You absolutely must go beyond historical materialism, which sees people primarily as economic beings.
As Homo economicus.
Right. And just like she rejects Freud's reduction of everything to sexuality, his sexual monism, she rejects Engels' economic monism for the same basic reason.
Why?
Because their big categories, clitoral versus vaginal pleasure for Freud, or bourgeois versus proletarian for Engels, they're just too crude, too abstract. They don't capture the lived reality of a specific, concrete woman.
So underneath underneath economic history, underneath psychological drives, there's something else.
Yes, what she calls that crucial existential infrastructure. This fundamental structure of human existence, of consciousness in the world, is what allows us to understand the unique shape and meaning of an individual life.
So insights from other fields are still useful. Biology, psychoanalysis, Marxism.
Oh, absolutely. Freud is valuable because we are bodies. Our bodily experience shapes how we encounter the world and translates our existential situation. Marxism is valuable because our big existential projects, how we try to be in the world, definitely take shape based on material realities, especially technology. But Beauvoir insists sexuality and technology on their own don't explain the whole picture. You have to integrate them into the whole of human reality, into that broader existential context.
Without that context, things like social rules, psychological drives, historical events, they just seem arbitrary, accidental.
Pretty much. To really understand women, Beauvoir argues, we need to use all these perspectives, but understand how they are grasped and given meaning by the existing human subject, man-woman, from the overall perspective of his existence.
So the value of things like strength, or the phallus, or a tool, isn't inherent in the thing itself.
No, it's defined within a world of values, and that world is ultimately shaped by what she calls the fundamental project of the existent transcending itself toward being.
That core human drive, to reach beyond ourselves, to become something more, to make meaning.
That's the bedrock layer she believes historical materialism fundamentally misses.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here? This deep dive really shows Beauvoir giving historical materialism its due, right? Appreciating how it highlights history, economy, technology.
Definitely. She sees its power in showing how those forces shape human reality and specifically women's situation, but ultimately she finds it deeply insufficient.
Because reducing humans to homo economicus, just economic agents, leaves out too much.
Way too much. She points to these deeper dimensions. The desire for property and where it comes from, that fundamental drive to dominate the other, the undeniable complexity of sexuality and reproduction.
And overarching all of that, this core human project of transcendence, of projecting ourselves beyond our current state.
These aren't side issues for her. They're essential to understanding the human condition and why woman occupies the specific place she does within it.
So she argues for this existential infrastructure, a framework that helps us see how the body, sex, tools, economics, how all these things get their meaning within the whole of human reality, driven by that fundamental need to transcend.
Exactly. It's a much richer, more complex picture.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often today do we still lean on purely economic explanations or purely biological ones for really complex human situations? And what crucial aspects of our existence, what deeper drives like the one Beauvoir identifies, are we missing when we do that?